Hello, everyone. Pastor George here with today's Bible study recap. And today in Bible study, we started the Christmas story by looking at Luke chapter 1, verses 26 through 56. Basically, what I've decided to do over these weeks going up to Christmas and 1 week after is to look at the traditional Christmas story as we look at it every year in the way that maybe you would be in a pageant. And what that means, it means combining Luke and Matthew, right? Because that's usually what happens in these things. Rarely you get only one telling, and that's because we harmonize the stories together in our presentations of this, right? And so we're going to be looking first at Luke. We're going to be looking at the Annunciation. Very important, right? This is when Mary is approached by the angel Gabriel and told that she is going to have a son, right? So this is the Annunciation. So very important, right? And the important thing to do when you look at these is to look at places where, like, you might normally see something mentioned, but then not really care about it or notice it, because we have heard these stories so many times, especially if you grew up in the church, right? You've heard the stories of the Christmas story so many times. Because they're so popular, right? Even in the outside culture, you'll see references or people knowing what these things are. And so it's up to us to kind of dig a little deeper and see what else is going on here. And this is tough for me because there is a lot here. So I wanted to focus mostly, though, on the way that Mary refers to herself. So, and of course, there's a lot of other important things to look at. All right, I'm not saying that's the only important thing, but if you go to Luke chapter 1, if you go right there at the beginning, right, or the one or the Annunciation itself, right, the way that Mary is referring to herself, I think, is pretty important. I guess also the way that she's referred to by the angel Gabriel. He calls her favored. Sometimes you'll see that translated as full of grace. That isn't always helpful because it's not Mary who's full of grace, it's the grace that God has given her. That's why favored is a little better, right? So you who are highly favored, you'll see a lot of Bibles say something like that, right? Mary does have grace, but it's not her own. That, it's not something she's projecting. It's something God has done for her, right? So you get that. I know. All right. So the thing I wanted to focus on is at the very end of the Annunciation in verse 38, because we're also going to look at the Magnificat as well. She says she's a servant of the Lord. Now, oftentimes, right, we use that word servant, but the Greek is very clear, right? That's the word slave in Greek. Many English translation Bibles, specifically with the United States in mind, so committees that are American or selling books that are going to be popular in America will often change that word to make it less direct for kind of, I think, obvious reasons. America has a history of slavery. We're very allergic to that type of language being used. And of course, like, this isn't saying like chattel slavery, so you don't want people to get confused as well, because slavery looked different in the ancient world than it did in the American context. Even so, I think it's really important that we translate that word as slave, because I think it implies who you see as being your guider or owner, right? Who is in control of you, and that is God. And Mary in this story uses this word twice to refer to herself. So she first uses it here when she goes, yes, I will do this. I am a servant of the Lord, right? I am a slave of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word. And the angel departed from her. Right? That's very important kind of thing, especially during the Advent season, right? To remind ourselves of who we ultimately serve. And Mary's a wonderful example of that. And then she goes to see Elizabeth, and you get the baby John the Baptist prophesying in the womb about who Jesus is. But then, in response to the prophecy that John and then Elizabeth give, you have Mary sing the Magnificat, which comes from the Latin magnify. So that's the first word in this, right? My soul magnifies the Lord. In Latin, that would just be Magnificat, right? Magnificat ama mea Domini. Anima mea Domini. My soul magnifies the Lord. So, but he continues going. She continues going forward, right? So she talks about herself first, where she says, "He has looked on the humble estate of his servant." And it says, "For behold, from now on, all generations will call me blessed." There's that word slave again, right? So Mary is again saying this about herself, that she is identifying with this word, this concept of her being owned by God, right? That she is doing His will in carrying this forward, right? But then you get it again. So it starts with the personal focus. So just what God has done for Mary in this, right? She sees this as a massive blessing, which I think is always important to remind ourselves of, is that this isn't, what, despite all the other things that are going on, right? This is a great blessing for her. That's how she sees it. But at the end, she uses this word to apply to something else, this doulos, this slave word, and she uses it to apply to Israel, right? He has helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, as he spoke to our fathers, to Abraham, and to his offspring forever. So Israel is supposed to be the servant of the Lord. And this is where you and I are brought in, right? Because Israel is whoever worships the true God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the triune God of the Bible, right? That is Israel. And so us, right, we are his servant. We are his slave, and meant to be obedient and to follow him, right? And so I think, like, one of the things that this caused me to pause and think about when reading this is to go, yeah, this is an important concept. Like, how often do we see ourselves as servants or slaves of God, that we are supposed to do what he tells us to do? The flip side of this, right, is, someone might reject that and say, I don't want to be a slave to anyone. But the flip side is you're always a slave to someone, right? That's the witness of this, right? Is you either are a slave to the Lord, or, as Martin Luther would say, a slave to the devil, or if you want to say, maybe not pointed directly at one particular thing, a slave to sin, or a slave to greed, or a slave to whatever, your own lust or your own pleasure or whatever else, right? You're always going to put something as your guiding principle. Your guiding principle is going to be the master of your life. And so Mary here identifies for Christians what should be the master of our life, right? She points us to the important thing, which is being a servant of the Lord. So that's just one thing we talked about this morning, but the one that was kind of most meaningful to me. I hope you found that interesting. Enjoy your Bible reading. I'll see you tomorrow for an episode of A New Thing. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday. Peace out.